Good evening, I'm Nima and this is Forum Daily for Monday, February 13th. We start the newscast tonight with a search in the Yukon wilderness. Efforts are underway in Yukon to find the remnants of an unidentified object shot down on Saturday over the territory. Canadian military and RCMP recovery teams have been joined by a CP-160 aircraft in the search for the object. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and Yukon Premier Louis Belanger met today. The two were in Whitehorse for previously scheduled talks. Defense Minister Anita Anand said on Saturday that the Yukon object was potentially similar to the Chinese spy balloon destroyed on February 4th. A fourth object was shot down on Saturday from over Lake Huron. Well, amid growing public attention over North American aerospace, the Royal Canadian Air Force is struggling with a personnel shortage. This even as it plans to introduce new military equipment. Between plans to buy armed drones, launch satellites, and upgrade North America's early warning system, the F-35 is just one of several high-tech additions. Lieutenant General Eric Kenney suggests that these will firmly entrench the Royal Canadian Air Force in the 21st century over the next decade. However, General Kenney says the Air Force is short by nearly 2,000 full-time members and 500 reservists at a time when it should be expanding. All right, shifting gears to federal health care funding, most of Canada's premiers will meet with the federal health minister at some point this week to discuss the proposed plan. Minister Jean-Yves Duclos was in Nova Scotia today. The federal proposal looks to add $46 billion to federal health transfers over the next 10 years. In accepting the deal, the provinces would have to agree to show how they will spend the money and measures progress. They also have to overhaul their digital health data collection systems to improve tracking and accessibility. Over to Newfoundland and Labrador now, where a long-awaited inquiry into the treatment of Innu youth in provincial care has begun. The inquiry is happening in Shishachiyou, one of two Innu communities in Labrador. The inquiry will look into Innu history and the systemic barriers they face, as well as investigate several cases of Innu children who died while in the care of the government. The government first announced a memorandum of understanding with the Innu Nation in 2017 to pursue the inquiry. All right, well, next door in Quebec, an inquest began today into the 2020 killings of two sisters by their father. An October 2021 coroner's report found flaws in the police investigation into the deaths of 11-year-old Nora and 6-year-old Romy Carpentier by their father Martin, who took his own life. The three vanished after their car was involved in a serious crash southwest of Quebec City on July 8, 2020. But an Amber Alert was not issued until the next day. The girls' bodies were discovered in nearby woods after an intense 10-day manhunt. Turning to a gas explosion in a suburb near the nation's capital, which has left 12 people, including 2 children, injured. Ottawa Paramedic Services say 6 people were taken to hospital following the explosion in Orleans, including the 2 children. They say 2 men have serious injuries, but all in hospital are in stable condition. Other injured people were released at the scene. Ottawa's deputy fire chief says the explosion occurred around 6:18 a.m. local time and affected 4 homes that were under construction. In Canada's largest city, Toronto's budget chief says Mayor John Tory is committed to finishing the city's budget process after a shock resignation announced on Friday. Mr. Tory stunned political observers when he admitted to having an affair with a former staff member and that he would step down as mayor. The move had raised questions about what would come next for both the mayor's office and Toronto's 2023 budget. Though there is not yet word on who will act as Mr. Tory's successor, Deputy Mayor Jennifer McKelvey is widely expected to fill the role. Meanwhile, the body of the longest-serving mayor in Mississauga, Ontario, was lying in state again today ahead of her funeral tomorrow. Hazel McCallion died last month at her Mississauga home at the age of 101 of pancreatic cancer. The woman, affectionately known as Hurricane Hazel, developed a legacy of feisty advocacy during more than 3 decades as mayor of one of Canada's fastest-growing cities. And on the West Coast, a record has been set by Cam Levins of Black Creek, BC. He set a Canadian half-marathon record yesterday when he won Vancouver's first half in 1 hour and 18 seconds. Now, he becomes the first Canadian to break the 61-minute mark in the 21.1-kilometer race. He also holds the national marathon record. Olympian Natasha Wodak of Surrey, BC, won the first half women's title, lowering her event record to 70 minutes and 17 seconds. Forum Daily will return after the break, and when we come back, we're going to take a more in-depth look at the unknown objects found in North American airspace. Stay with us. We'll be right back after a short break. Amid a spike in unknown objects being taken down across North America, one expert says that this is a sign that our defenses are working well. The deputy director for the Center for Defense and Security Studies says it's possible that the recent spat of unknown objects entering and being shot down from North America's skies are testing NORAD's capabilities. James Ferguson of the University of Manitoba says if that's the case, then the tests have failed. He says that since the objects have been taken down, quote, you cannot penetrate North American airspace without repercussions. Still, both the Canadian and American governments have said little about who may be behind the incursions. With us now to discuss unknown objects and North American security is Dr. Rob Huebert, a defense expert and associate professor at the University of Calgary. Dr. Huebert, welcome back to Forum Daily.
It's always my pleasure.
Always great to have you, Dr. Huebert. So a lot happening in the skies this month. In fact, in just the past 10 days, we've seen 4 aerial objects being shot down over Canada and the U.S. So what sort of information do we have on these flying objects?
Well, we have that the militaries are taking it so serious, as my friend Jim Ferguson said in your opening statements. We are seeing that NORAD is able to track and shoot down these particular events, and so the information beyond that is pretty sketchy. I mean, we're waiting to see whether or not we're able to cover anything in the -32 of the Yukon shooting, and of course, the other one being down in the Lake Huron is also problematic. And so, at this point, we've got suspicions about who's doing it, and that's on the basis of the fact that the weather balloon was Chinese. But we're still waiting to see any form of official notification about whether or not it is somebody just being silly with these things, which isn't really that probable, or if it's the Russian or the Chinese, which seems to be the American impressions at this point.
And as you say, the information is quite sparse, as sketchy as you say. So, if we're looking at this information, other than the Chinese balloon identified on February 4th, they're being described as cylindrical or octagonal objects. The most recent object flying over Lake Huron described as octagonal. So, what could these objects be? Are they other weather balloons? What are your thoughts on this?
Well, it sounds, I mean, we're not seeing any indications that they are in fact balloons, so they could possibly be sort of a modernized version of the old sort of airships. And so is that what we're seeing? I have to wait and see whether or not they are self-sustained, if they're balloons, or what in terms of for the recovery, because the pictures that have been released aren't clear. We're not even certain, or at least publicly, there hasn't been any notification that the whatever was shot down over Lake Huron is the same thing as what was shot down over the Yukon or in the other location. So in other words, we're not quite clear. And let's be clear, let's be honest on one other point. They're not releasing any information if there's any that have been missed. In other words, we're getting information being released by the authorities on the ones that have been tracked and the ones that have been shot down. And of course, so it leads a skeptic to ask the question, are there some that are being missed as they go through North American airspace?
And something to add to that, the U.S. has recently learned of a fleet of Chinese spy balloons. So, what do we know about this and its connection to the 4 objects that were downed over the past few days?
Well, we know starting around 2019, the Americans became very concerned about what initially was identified as UFOs. I mean, they've changed the terminology a little bit, so everyone's not thinking X-Files and little green men in this capacity. But there has been some American documentation relatively recently coming down in that they have seen a fairly significant increase, usually somewhere in the numbers of about 300 of their service personnel pointing out the identification of unidentified flying objects. And these have been both in terms of sight, in terms of radar signature, and others. So the Americans are concerned. They're seeing an increase. And whether or not these four, five entities that are now coming into our aerospace, if they represent the same of these fleets that have been coming in, or if this is something entirely different. And that's something, of course, we simply don't know publicly at this point.
All right, Dr. Huebert, looks like we've got a quick 30 seconds left here, but what are you keeping your eyes on as things develop in this situation?
Well, who's doing this and why are they doing it? Is it an attempt to test our capabilities? Are they not only doing the various electronics that they'll see, but are they also watching what we do in terms of determination? But it's chilling if you think that this is being orchestrated by someone who has spent a fairly significant amount of money taking risks with this. Why do they need this information right now?
All right, we'll be right back. After the break, we're going to take a look at foreign aid spending and the federal budget. While Ottawa has pledged to boost international aid funding, aid groups are worried that the government may not pay enough. Stay with us. The spring's federal budget can't come soon enough for Canada's aid sector, which it hopes will see no cuts. The Trudeau government has pledged to boost funding for international development every year, but aid groups fear that officials might peg that promise to pre-pandemic spending levels. This comes as Ottawa hones in on projects linked to climate change and reproductive health. Canada spent $6 billion in foreign aid the year before the pandemic. That figure has risen to more than $8 billion as Ottawa helped countries cope with COVID-19 and Russia's invasion of Ukraine. But advocates say a lack of predictability and transparency in the upcoming budget is causing a lot of anxiety for organizations working in developing countries. Well, joining us now to give us more perspective is Mr. Louis Belanger, campaign director at Bigger Than Our Borders, which advocates on behalf of major Canadian charities. Mr. Belanger, welcome to Forum Daily.
Thank you. Hello.
Now, looking at the numbers here, so pre-pandemic, the funding for foreign aid was earmarked at $6.6 billion. Following the arrival of the pandemic, the funding target was boosted to $8 billion. Now, we know the sector is watching to see if the funding would go back to 2019 levels. So can you give us a little bit more context into why the sector needs more funding rather than being cut back to 2019 levels?
Right. Well, it's an important question, and for us, it's sort of what has changed since the pandemic? It's not like problems have gone away. We see the issue of climate change having a direct impact in developing countries. We see the impact of hunger. We talk about a lot about hunger in sub-Saharan Africa and other parts of the world. The war in Ukraine is certainly not over. We see the deep impact of the war in Afghanistan and other crises. So in terms of when you talk about the needs that we're facing, and that the work that we'd like to do and the work that we'd like to continue to do, I do not think that it's the right time to cut foreign aid. So yes, COVID-19 and the pandemic was a traumatic time, and it gave a shock in the system in terms of all the focus was on the pandemic, and we kind of cut some of the attention away from things like education and healthcare. But it doesn't mean that developing countries are not facing incredible challenge, post-pandemic.
It's clear that there's no shortage of crises in the world, sir. Now, if funding were to be cut back to 2019 levels, what kind of an impact would that have on Canadian foreign aid projects?
Well, it would. We would need to see some cuts. So it's as simple as that. If you keep making promises and pledging to increase foreign aid, and on top of that, making promises like we have seen over the summer, like we have seen in New York at the UN General Assembly, well, if the envelope is full, then for me, what it means is you need to go back and cut somewhere. So that's what we're worried about, because I think we have a solid policy in place. It's called a feminist international assistance policy. It's something that is welcomed in developing countries. It's something that is welcomed by partners, both in developing countries and here in Canada. We'd like to keep going. And it has extremely solid program and a solid vision, which is what? Which is the empowerment of women and girls is the best way to tackle poverty. And it has very clear program and very clear vision of how to achieve that. Now, if you You mentioned when we started this, you talk about climate change and other issues that the government is now focused on. Well, if it keeps investing on climate change, then it needs, and it doesn't increase the envelope. Well, it means that the government is going to have to cut somewhere. Now, that doesn't mean we shouldn't invest in climate change. My point is, they have promised to increase the envelope. Let's just do that. Let's just keep increasing. We're on the right track. We have a solid policy in place, but it just needs an injection of fresh investment.
Mhm. Now, have any international projects been put on hold in anticipation of this upcoming budget announcement?
Great question. The answer is yes. So a lot of NGOs don't know what the budget is going to look like, don't know if we're going to see a substantial increase or whether we're going to go back, like we just talked about, to pre-pandemic levels. So what does that mean? Well, if Global Affairs Canada is not giving you any news and we don't know what the budget is going to look like, well, if you have a program that you'd like to renew, but you don't have an answer, so what do? Well, you start kind of, letting people go, you put the program on hold, and that is what's happening worldwide on issues like around nutrition, governance, social justice, economic empowerment, and that's worrying to me. And that's why I think we need clarity. I think we need transparency. And on top of that, of course, we need a solid budget that shows that the government is serious and ambitious when it comes to international development.
All right, Mr. Belanger, thank you again for your time today on Forum Daily. The death toll has risen to over 35,000 in last week's devastating set of earthquakes along the Turkey and Syria border, which brought down countless buildings across the region. The staggering death toll has contributed to a swell of anger over poor construction methods, which many see as a significant contributing factor. Turkey's construction codes meet current earthquake engineering standards, at least on paper, but they are rarely enforced. And to that end, Turkey's government has now begun to target contractors for investigation. Ukraine continues to battle with Russian forces in the city of Bakhmut. Ukraine's presidential office says fierce battles are raging outside of Bakhmut. This comes as Russian forces are pushing their advance on the southeastern city with heavy shelling and infantry attacks. The U.S. Embassy in Moscow has issued another warning to U.S. citizens to not travel to Russia for fear of harassment or detention. Meanwhile, Moldova's president claims that Russia has planned to overthrow her country's government. President Maya Sandu outlined what she is claiming as a plot by Moscow, which involved the use of external saboteurs. She claimed it would put her country at the disposal of Russia and derail Moldova's hopes of joining the European Union one day. Ms. Sandu's briefing comes a week after Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said that his country had intercepted plans by Russian secret services to destroy Moldova. Well, over to the South China Sea now, where tensions continue to boil. The Philippines have released a video of a Chinese ship emitting a laser-like beam toward one of its Coast Guard ships in the South China Sea. The Philippines says its vessel was hit with a military-grade laser, which temporarily blinded some of its crew members. The move violates Manila's sovereign rights. China's foreign ministry accused the ship of trespassing into Chinese waters. In the aftermath of several unidentified objects being shot down over North America, the United Kingdom says it will conduct a security review. Defense Secretary Ben Wallace says the UK and its allies will review what these airspace intrusions mean for their security. He adds that this development is another sign of how the global threat picture is changing for the worse. Mr. Wallace's announcement late Sunday came after U.S. fighter jets shot down an object over Lake Huron. It was the fourth of such downings over the U.S. or Canada this month. Moving to tensions in Israel, where thousands demonstrated outside the country's parliament building today. They are rallying against a bill that would give politicians greater power to appoint judges. The protest comes ahead of a preliminary vote on the bill. The vote is part of a judicial overhaul proposed by Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's government. Critics say an attempt to take over Israel's judicial system is tantamount to a coup and would destroy democracy in the country. Well, amid a rise in online misinformation, Google is expanding its pre-bunking campaign in Germany. The tech company says the idea works like a viral inoculation by priming a person's critical thinking skills to make them more resistant to false claims. Research shows that pre-bunking can be among the most effective tools to combat misinformation. This is because it's affordable and can be used on a large scale. Turning to big moves in the U.S., where lawmakers in 11 states have introduced bills addressing the right to repair for farmers. The bills would force farming equipment manufacturers to provide the tools, software, parts, and manuals needed for farmers to do their own repairs. It is a response to farmers being unable to repair their own tractors and combines. But the proposition has found pushback from manufacturers. Now they're worried about releasing trade secrets, the safety of users who could more easily tinker with the software, and the operator's ability to bypass the emissions controller. The skies over the Arabian Peninsula could soon get a little busier as Dubai takes another step toward flying taxis. This morning, the futuristic city-state offered its firmest details yet for a pledged launch by 2026. The focus appears to be on the electric flying taxi by Joby Aviation, a Santa Cruz, California-based company. Officials at Joby say they're exploring the possibility. Well, at an eventful Super Bowl, Kansas City Chiefs quarterback Patrick Mahomes continues to earn the hardware, leading the Chiefs to a 38-35 victory over the Philadelphia Eagles at the Super Bowl earned him and his teammates their second Vince Lombardi trophy in 4 years. He also earned his second Super Bowl MVP award. Now that's on top of 2 previous NFL MVP awards. This year's accomplishment comes despite a right ankle injury that obviously limited how well he could move. All right, I'm Nima Rajan, and that'll do it for your look at national and international news for today. Remember, for more news on demand, you could always visit our website, thenewsforum.ca, and make sure to follow us on our social media handles. We're available on Facebook, TikTok, Instagram, and Twitter. Take care, Canada. We'll see you next time on the Forum Daily News.